Hey everyone, let's jump into our tutorial on scopes in C Sharp. So as you can see, I have Visual Studio pulled up and the code from our last tutorial. So in our last tutorial, we used if, and else statements to create sort of like an ATM program. We had 3 users initially. I removed 1 user just to keep things simple. But besides that, everything is the same. It's still the same. So what I'd like to point out are these curly braces. So you might see that these curly braces might be the most common symbol used in this entire program. And what these curly braces do is they create what's called scope, or sometimes called context. And what this does is it defines an area of the code where a variable is valid. So I think that might be it might be easier to show you versus explaining it. So I'm going to create a string variable here called valid var, and we will set it to just maybe the letter X. So this valid variable was created in this scope, so between these 2 curly braces. If I go outside of these curly braces and I try to access valid var, you can see it's not coming up in the list of valid variables, right? If I try to access it here, I type VLA, oops. If I type here VLA, we see it's in this list of valid variables here. And I can choose it and it gets autofilled. I'm going to delete it now. And if we go outside of the scope and I try to access valid var, if I type VLA again the same way, except this time it's outside of these curly braces, you can see it doesn't come up in the list of valid variables because it's no longer valid. This valid var variable does not exist outside of these 2 curly braces. So if I type valid var, I'll get an error here. You see that red squiggly signifies an error. If I hover over the error messaging, the error message says the name valid var does not exist in current context. So I hope that that's apparent. You cannot access a variable outside of the curly braces that it was declared in. So let's go out 1 layer. So we see that we have this curly brace here and here. So that is a scope. We go down 1, we see that there's curly braces here and here. This is another scope. This is another scope. Now we also see below this curly brace, we see another curly brace. And so that creates another scope. So you can see how these scopes, they're inside of one each other, like those Russian nesting dolls, where it's those little women, and you pop open one and there's another little one inside of it. You pop that open, there's another little one inside of it. So it's the same way with scopes in this example. So let's scroll back up, and we see that in this main method, we'll get into what a method is later, but just know that this main method has created a scope right here. And so this scope starts here, and you can see it's orange right here, as this little orange highlight here. If we scroll down, it'll show you the corresponding closing curly brace, and that's down here. So now every variable we created here inside of this scope is good or is valid all the way down here. So if we took our first username, and we tried to access it inside of this scope, do you think you can do that or no? Let's see. First user, yes, see, it's in our list of variables. You can access it in this scope because this scope is inside of this larger scope here. Remember that Russian nesting doll example? It's the same thing. You can have a scope inside of another scope. And in fact, it's very common to have a scope inside of another scope. So just to make this a little bit crazier, you can see above this, there's another scope even outside of this, and another scope even outside of this. So we'll get into in later tutorials what all this stuff is. But for right now, what I'd like you guys to understand is that these curly braces create what is called scope. And if you create something inside of a scope, as soon as you leave it, that value is no longer accessible. You can't get to that value. And I know that this is a lot to take in, but there are ways around it. But for the most part, if you create a variable inside of a scope, you cannot access it outside of that scope. All right, thanks, guys.